Yeah, thanks. I'm Rob Holte, and I'm presenting work that was primarily done by PhD student Gaojian Fan. Me and Martin Mueller are his co-supervisors. Just to put in a plug, Gaojian should be wrapping up his PhD in the next, by the end of this year for sure, and so anybody who's looking to hire a really bright young man, then you can contact me. Just as a reminder, this crowd probably knows mostly what merge and shrink is. It's been talked about in this session already, but I'll just remind you that it's a method for creating abstractions which then give rise to heuristics. It starts with a set of transition systems, call it P, and then it goes into this simple loop where each time around the loop it takes two transition systems out of the set, computes their product, that's in step 6, and removes those two transition systems. So every time around this loop, the set gets one smaller, and eventually, if you run this to completion, then you get down to having only one transition system, and that then defines your heuristic. This is really a framework, it's not a specific system, and so you have to fill in a few blanks here. So one of them is which pair of transition systems. You might start off with 1,000 transition systems in this set, which pair do you choose, and so that's called the merging strategy. The other thing that's important, and will be important in this talk, is that there is a size limit to how large a transition system can get. When you take the product of two transition systems, at least roughly speaking, the size of the product is the product of the sizes, and so at some point you will need to shrink one or both of the transition systems before you do take their product. And again, there's many ways that you might do that, so that's called the shrinking strategy. And there's a third step in the middle there that you can see I haven't highlighted, called label reduction. I'm not going to say anything about it. It's not part of this talk, but it is part of the overall merge and shrink framework. So that's just background information for those of you who aren't too familiar with this. So what will you see in this talk, and what did we present in the paper? We presented two new merge and shrink methods. In other words, ways of filling in that framework. DMHQ is a new merge and shrink method based on a new merging strategy. MS-Lite is a new method based on a new shrinking strategy. And probably the most important contribution of the paper is this thing called Lite-enhanced merge and shrink, which takes the maximum of the MS-Lite heuristic and some other merge and shrink heuristic, whichever is your favorite. Now, taking the maximum of two heuristics is an ancient idea, so you might ask, why is that a contribution? The reason it's a contribution is just as it happens, MS-Lite has a very high complementarity with other merge and shrink methods that exist, and so it's the fact that they're complementary that really adds the power to this simple idea and well-known idea of taking a maximum. So let's start by talking about DMHQ, funny little name. The DM part stands for dynamic miasm. Again, I don't expect everybody in the audience to know what that is, but it's an existing merge and shrink method which is actually pretty compute intensive. Because remember, you've got this big set of transition systems, and it actually looks at all possible pairs and constructs the product of every possible pair and then computes a score. And then it keeps the one pair that has the best score. Okay, so it's awfully expensive. So if you had 1,000 pairs, then yeah, you'd do all those computations and just keep one of them. Of course, the other pairs will still be there next time around. So HQ is our addition to dynamic miasm. One of the peculiar things about merge and shrink is the point is to create a good heuristic, but nobody directly measures how good the heuristic is during this construction phase. They measure other things instead. So for example, the score that dynamic miasm computes has absolutely nothing to do with the heuristic value of the start state. So we thought that it would be maybe a simple contribution, an easy contribution, to just take some measure of heuristic quality, that's what the HQ stands for, or heuristic improvement, and use that as in combination with maybe some of these other scores as a way of improving the merge and shrink, or the merging strategy. So we tried all sorts of things, and in fact it was much more difficult than we expected to add this extra piece, which seems like an obvious thing to add. But what ended up working best among the things we looked at was to use the HQ score, which is directly a measure of heuristic improvement, to decide among the pairs with the same DM score. So it's a tiebreaker. You first of all look at the dynamic miasm score, and of all the guys who have the same best DM score, you use the HQ score to select among them. So as an experimental evaluation, this is the kind of plot that we're all used to seeing, but just to explain, the x and y axis show the number of nodes expanded by one or the other of a merge and shrink method. So DMHQ is on the y-axis, and SCC-DFP, which is the state-of-the-art merge and shrink method, is on the x-axis. That's the number of nodes expanded, and it's a log scale. Each data point here is a single problem instance from a large set of IPC planning competition instances. Two special things to note are the extreme edges. The extreme right edge are problems that were not solved by where the construction failed. It timed out on construction time. It timed out during construction phase for SCC-DFP, and the top line is the same thing for DMHQ. It timed out or ran out of time during construction phase. And then there's also a dashed line, a horizontal dashed line and a vertical dashed line. For example, there. Oh no, that's sorry. There's the vertical dashed line, and come on, you can do it. Here's the horizontal dashed line. That shows you places where the construction finished, but the problem wasn't solved because the search ran out of time before the problem was solved. Okay, so those are important things to notice. So what do we see in this picture? You want the number of nodes expanded to be small, and so if it's below the diagonal, that means that number of nodes expanded using DMHQ is smaller than using SCC-DFP, so that's kind of the good news. That's what we were hoping with this tie-breaking. The coverage results, which are reflected by those things on the two horizontal and two vertical bars where problems weren't solved for one reason or another, are really mixed coverage results. Sometimes one domain was solved by one and not by the other. And overall, the coverage results are kind of fairly close. It's +10 for DMHQ, but I wouldn't call that a resounding success. But DMHQ will become important later in the talk when we get to this idea of Lite-enhanced MS merge and shrink. While we were trying to figure out what was going wrong or why adding the heuristic quality measure was not working as well as we expected, we came across an accidental discovery, which I thought is worth sharing with you, and it also leads to the second half of the talk on MS-Lite. So I mentioned there was a size limit with merge and shrink, and what do you expect should happen as you increase the allowable size of the transition systems? Well, you would expect that you have more information. Ultimately, the abstraction you build is larger, and so more informative, capturing or retaining more of the information about the original domain. So you think you would see a picture like this one, where as the size limit increases, the number of nodes expanded to solve the problem decreases. And as you can see in this plot, that's what happens. But what happens now from this point onwards if we start making the memory or the size limits smaller is, and this is real data, by the way, this isn't something I made up for the slide, is something funny just happened. We went from down by an order of magnitude. The size limit that we have imposed is a limit order of magnitude smaller than 10 to the fourth, but the number of nodes expanded is half. Didn't double, it halved. Okay, that's the unexpected direction. And if we go down further, there's another order of magnitude reduction in the size limit and another halving of the number of nodes expanded. And what if we go down to the absolute minimum size? So in merge and shrink, the kind of shrinking that we're doing is called H-preserving. This means that it will never combine, the way you do shrinking is to take two abstract states and combine them into one abstract state. It will never combine two different abstract states if they're different distance from the goal. Okay, so the absolute smallest that you can have with a H-preserving abstraction is one where you have a single state for every different distance from the goal. In this particular example, that would be 15 abstract states. So min here is we actually obtain it by setting the size limit in fast downward to 0, but it won't actually create such a small one. So it's 15 in this example. And so, and you can see the number of nodes expanded is tiny, really, compared to what's happening with any of the other size limits. So this was unexpected. It's a strange phenomenon. But we thought, well, maybe there's something here. Maybe there's some real meat on this bone. And so why don't we define a merge and shrink method that does exactly this? And that is MS-Lite. MS-Lite always, at all stages, it doesn't wait to run into a size limit. You honestly just set the size limit in fast downward to 0, and you let it run. And so at every stage, every transition system is reduced to a linear chain you do the maximum shrink you can as early as possible. So that's what MS-Lite is. Obviously, it's very fast to do, and it typically is very small in terms of the size of the abstraction. One of the very strange things we have no explanation for is, you might ask yourself, this is really a shrinking strategy. What merging strategy would you use in combination with it? And we have not found that it matters at all. So in the paper, just in order to emphasize this point, we actually choose the pair of transition systems at random out of the big set. And we repeat the experiment 5 times and get virtually no variance. So that's MS-Lite. And I just want to point out that this strange phenomenon about making the size limit smaller and having better performance was so unusual that we thought we should spend some space in the paper giving a fully worked out example. So we did that, but we discovered a few weeks ago when I was preparing for this lecture that in fact there was some regrettable little tiny things that are wrong in there, but they don't fundamentally affect the correctness of the example. Is perfectly correct. But just as an example, the size limit should be 8, not 4. So sorry about that, but these things just happen. So now let's just have a look at MS-Lite versus SCC-DFP, which as I said is state of the art. This is the same exact kind of picture. Nodes expanded. Each point is one instance from the ICP. And just as you'd expect, MS-Lite is not creating a particularly good heuristic. Almost all the data points are above the diagonal, but that's not really the point here. The point is that there's all these things on the right-hand side where SCC-DFP is running out of time during construction. It doesn't even get to the search phase. It's running out of time during construction, so it's just simply too slow. So whether it creates a good heuristic or not only matters if it finishes within the time limit. And then at the top line, we have kind of the opposite position where the MS-Lite heuristic is simply not good enough. It's finishing and it's starting to do the search, but the search is not completing. And that's because the heuristic is too poor. And so this is the complementariness that I was referring to earlier, and it's sort of obvious to you, but I'll just put it on the slide so that I can state the obvious. MS-Lite requires very little time and memory to construct, and it often does produce a heuristic that is good enough. Like, although I highlighted those points along the top dashed edge, there was also a whole lot of points in the interior of the graph which were solved by both systems. And although MS-Lite was needing more node expansions, it was actually solving those problems. On the other hand, other methods like SCC-DFP and DMHQ, the one I talked about earlier in the talk, they have a high construction time or a high memory need at construction time, and they typically produce good heuristics. And so you can see that these things should work well together, and that's what we did. And that's what we call Lite-enhanced merge and shrink. The way that we actually implemented this was described on this slide. We first of all construct the MS-Lite heuristic, because that's basically free. We then set a time and memory limit for whatever other merge and shrink method we're using. We don't want it to run out of time. We want to give search a chance, and so we typically give it about half the time that you give for the total process. If the construction of that other merge and shrink finishes, then we use the maximum of the two, and if not, we just use the MS-Lite's heuristic. So that's kind of a simple way of combining things. You could undoubtedly think of more sophisticated ways of doing it, but that's what we did kind of to prove the point. So how does this enhance coverage? If you do this trick that I just showed you, here's SCC-DFP, the one that was state-of-the-art at the beginning of this talk. In this set that we're using for our experiments, it had a coverage of 671, and then when you did this MS-Lite, or the Lite-enhanced version, that went up by, 48. And now if you do the same, you can apply this to any of the existing methods, and so here's what happens if you apply it. If you do Lite-enhanced dynamic miasm, it raises almost 60, 57, that it goes up. And if you do it to DMHQ, and this is where DMHQ comes back into the talk, it goes up by 65. So you get although there was only a difference of 10 between SCC-DFP and DMHQ in their original forms, DMHQ benefited more from being Lite-enhanced by a pretty big margin. And so you've got, if you compare the top left of the corner to the bottom right, the overall improvement by the two contributions in this paper raises you up, what is that, 75 as coverage. So that's reasonably significant. So just as a conclusion, I don't know where I am on time, but I think I'm probably doing pretty good. This is really a classical balancing act between the time allocated to create a heuristic and the time allocated to search. And if you spend all your time creating a wonderful heuristic but have no time to use it, that's a losing situation. And if you spend no time creating a heuristic and spend all your time doing search, that's probably a losing proposition too. So there's some kind of sweet spot in the middle. And this talk has been about merge and shrink, but as an old-time heuristic search guy, we kind of saw the same thing in the pattern database world, where you could spend a very little time building a small pattern database, and it probably wouldn't be a very good heuristic, but you'd have lots of time for search. And again, I don't know that there's been quite enough research into, and I don't know if anything can really be seriously theoretically said about how to balance these two, but there is an issue there for sure. So then the bottom bullet point here is just repeating what I said. But I want to mention one thing at the bottom, at the very bottom point says make sure there's adequate search time by limiting the heuristic construction time. I just was talking to Sylvain Sievers at lunch. He has a paper that's going to appear in SOX, which is in Stockholm in a couple of weeks, that actually has exactly the same idea. So it's an idea that kind of was independently invented by Sylvain Sievers and Gaojian. And so you might want to talk to Sylvain. He's around here somewhere. Are you here, Sylvain? So that's Sylvain Sievers. If you want to find out what his brilliant idea was, then I won't try to present it on his behalf. Okay, that is the end of the presentation, so happy to take questions.
Okay, questions? Okay, I'll try.
So you're using the heuristic in this HQ version as a tiebreaker, right? In this DIN HQ version?
Which version of what?
In the, what is it? Is it a VMHQ, yes. So you're using the heuristic improvement as a tiebreaker.
Oh, yes, oh sorry, okay, I didn't hear the whole question, yeah.
Okay, so have you tried using it as the most important concept?
So that was, I alluded to the fact that we tried many different things, and we were really surprised. We actually thought that using it as the primary search key or decision-making would be the right thing to do, and then use these structural things like the number of the amount of free shrinking you get, which is what miasm does, would be good secondary measures. But it just didn't work out. Like, we ended up doing it this way because we tried a bunch of things, and we either got no improvement or less improvement than this shows. And as you see, this only got, like, in terms of coverage, it was only 10 more than SCC-DFP, so the other ones were not that good. There's a few others, not the one you just asked about, but there's a few others that are mentioned in the paper where we, because when you ask about, when you say you're going to measure heuristic improvement, there's a bunch of different ways you could measure that, and so we talk about a couple of different ideas that we tried in that regard are mentioned in the paper, and they, like everything else, were not as good as, the one we ended up presenting is the one that was the winner of the whole lot, but it was surprising to me, and I don't have a good explanation for why measuring heuristic quality shouldn't be the primary measure. Now, it is true that if you think about especially if you think about the early stages, the quality of the heuristic when you have only two variables that you're taking into account is they're probably all the same, right? And so it's only when you get towards the latter stages, and you could imagine a system that perhaps would switch. It would use these more structural things in the early stages, and then when you got towards the later stage, because when you get towards the later stages, you're really starting to get to the point where that is the heuristic value of the start state, right? And so maybe when you get to the later stages, we should swap it around or something like that. But we didn't try anything fancy like that.
There's still time left, okay. So I'm slightly less surprised by that, because there's many situations, and I think it's an original merge shrink paper not the DFP one, but by us, and also the journal paper, where merge and shrink will automatically exploit additivity. So there's causal graph-based criteria for that. And for that, it doesn't matter when you add the variable in. So basically, there's certain variables that will always improve your heuristic value, but it makes no difference at all whether you add them now or later. That's often the easiest way to improve the heuristic. You're getting this improvement guaranteed. But if you merge them in right now, when you have no causal graph connection, it's sort of the worst thing you can do, because there's no possible shrinking you can do after merging. There's no possible reduction. There's sort of nothing you're getting from the merge other than basically the sum of the two heuristics,
I see.
which you will get anyway. So what I would suggest is sort of combine this idea with some sort of filtering that says only combine things that are causally related. And then maybe you'll see something slightly different.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Michael has a question.
Well done. You're getting better.
So I'm wondering about the MS-Lite one. So do you think there are any theoretical guarantees on the informativeness of that heuristic as compared to other heuristics families?
Are there theoretical guarantees? You know, again, as an old-time guy, it's very hard to get theoretical guarantees of any kind out of any kind of abstraction. So I'd be a little bit surprised. There's other experts in the room if they have any. So no brilliant idea. I'm sort of a theory guy, so no brilliant idea occurs to me. Yeah, no brilliant idea occurs to me. It's possible, because the H-preserving is such a strong mechanism, it's possible that you might be able to say something. I mean, you can definitely bound it, right? When you take two things that are both H-preserved and they're just linear, you know, what's the biggest possible, let's say they're all unit costs, okay, just to keep things simple. Well, you know, you could get a snake, you know, that got you n times m, or you could get a diagonal, which would be the maximum, or is it the minimum, of n and m. So I mean, so those are like your limits on what that chain size could be. Getting the snake is you can almost rule it out as highly improbable. It's not theoretically impossible. So chances are you'll get something more like a diagonal, so that when you merge two of those things, you'll get a line that's not a whole lot different than what you got. Once you get into non-unit cost domains, then anything can happen, right?
Okay, we are running out of time.
Oh, sorry.